Welcome, dear listeners, to another episode of Music and Politics. Dis of Dissent, Sounds of Subversion. Today, Imperialism and Orientalism in Music, an outgrowth of nationalism. The construct of the other will discuss this compelling concept as developed by the Palestinian American intellectual Edward Said. We'll look at opera houses in the tropics, the steppes of Central Asia, and sounds from Africa to Central Asia. Please stay with us. Don't forget to like and subscribe on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. And we're always looking for membership support on Patreon. You'll get exclusive reading lists, listening lists, and consultations to further your learning. So, the concept here for today, in political philosophy, the idea of colonialism, imperialism, and Orientalism in the 19th century, they emerge out of a later phase of nationalism as it turns expansionist, yes, even oppressive, yes. One landmark text written by V.I. Lenin defines famously imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism, yes, an outgrowth of Marx's dynamism built into the capitalist system, ever expanding, ever looking for new markets. And imperialism, of course, indicates a kind of annexation or retention of the other against its will, which arguably is the exact opposite of the original energy behind nationalism, which was meant to be a liberating force for new groups, new identities, political identities that had been submerged under old dynasties, old empires. But the nation-state becomes then a force expanding throughout the rest of the world and goes beyond even the kind of colonialism of the pre-modern era, if you look at either the Spanish or the Portuguese Empire, right? Many people look, of course, to the Dutch East India Company as the first joint stock-traded company that develops really from the so-called Spice Islands, from Malacca, from what is then Indonesia, and eventually, of course, the modern state subsumes this energy. And if we can pick one starting point to discuss today, Napoleon in Egypt. Yes, if we look at this clash between the energy and culture of the French Revolution as embodied, as continued to some extent by Napoleon, and then the society of Mamluk Egypt, yes, which at the time is, of course, nominally part of the Ottoman Empire, even though it has a kind of almost like a military junta style governing system there. And Napoleon, of course, famously brings a whole team of Enlightenment-inspired scientists and researchers, right, famously discovering the Rosetta Stone, which unlocks so many of the mysteries of the ancient world as it forms a kind of instant dictionary for reading hieroglyphs from the ancient world. And then thereafter, of course, follows a whole slew of invasions and conquests of the region. Famously, if we look to France and Algeria in North Africa, where Delacroix puts to canvas a kind of sensuousness, yes, and intoxicating, both fleshiness, color, scent, all of which radiating right from the canvas, and some of which we'll hear in music itself. And Orientalism, if we think of it as a cultural construct of the East, of that which is unchanging, unmodern, one-dimensionally archaic and exotic. You might think of it as, on the one hand, a cultural byproduct of imperialism, but it really is ultimately a kind of a discourse of racism, or a genre within racism itself, applied specifically, right, despite the somewhat confusing terminology of the Orient, by which is meant in its original context the Near East, the immediate Near East, which is really, of course, the Mediterranean basin, yes. Speaking of Egypt and Algeria, these are, of course, lands that, if one goes back to the Roman times, were indissolubly a part of the European Latin civilization. And, of course, this coincides with archaeology, and archaeology is a dimension of this imperialism itself, and one of the significant dimensions, for instance, of the construction of, whether it's the Suez Canal in Egypt or the Berlin to Baghdad Railway, is that European companies receive concessions whereby they're able to retain any archaeological treasures that are unearthed. Well, if we let's turn to Cairo to begin with. Cairo's Grand Opera House, itself a kind of tool of cultural imperialism, yes? And this is, right in front of it, a monument to Ibrahim Pasha, a westernizing ruler of Egypt at the time, and to inaugurate, right, this grand construct, which really was an opera house with palm trees surrounding it at the time. They ensnared probably the most famous grand opera composer of the day, Giuseppe Verdi, who famously wrote his opera Aida, right, which itself is kind of a tale of ancient imperialism about Egyptian conquest into what in the ancient period would have been Sudan and Ethiopia, which interestingly mirrors the 19th century history of the Muhammad Ali dynasty under the Ottoman Empire, which also becomes a kind of conquering power in its own right. But let's turn to some of the music here of the famous Nile scene from Aida, from Act 3. And it's really an attempt to conjure up, already you have this, right, opera set in ancient Egypt itself, and one of the great losses culturally, going back through the course of time, is what the music of the ancient world would have sounded like. Even though, of course, we can create and we have visual texts, the music is much more elusive. So this is an attempt here of Verdi to kind of reconstruct, right, especially flute music, what it might have sounded like, but also capturing the kind of sensuousness and this echo of eternity, which is so much a part of the Orientalist construct. So the Nile scene from Verdi's Aida. it closes out with a chorus, right? That's, of course, so central to the voice and music of nationalism, creating a collective voice that sings as one. And in this case, it also relates to the kind of the worship of Isis, of Magna Mater, of the great female goddess, right, female deity, right, so long repressed in the modern world until arguably the apparitions of the Virgin Mary, right, re-inaugurate this kind of mother goddess for worship there. And you might have heard, of course, there's a kind of family resemblance to what's perhaps the most iconic work of Orientalism in music itself, Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov's Scheherazade. And Rimsky-Korsakov came from a long line of mariners, of sailors in the Russian Imperial Navy, and the opening music, right, you can hear really does have all of the rocking of the waves, right, almost that you might get a kind of seasickness just listening to the opening part of Scheherazade, the sea and Sinbad's ship. So let's give a listen again. We started with that just to remind you of how that sounds. And Scheherazade, right, taken from the famous tales of the Arabian Nights, yes, where the sultan who vows to take new wife each night is held off from execution, yes, by one particularly inspired and beautiful woman who's able to hold the executioner's hand through her inventive tales here. So it's kind of, right, a romance within a romance, an Orientalist tale par excellence here. And Rimsky, of course, in terms of his own musical and stance within the cultural politics of his day, and it's notable that he was really part of a battle within Russian cultural politics, which is usually referred to as Westernization versus Slavophilism, although there's a big Orientalist dimension there that, right, Rimsky is trying to use a kind of energy that comes from something more authentic, right, forged from the people, forged from outside of the academy. And I mean, quite literally, he was part of a circle which in Russian was called Moguchkaya Ruchka, which can be translated, it often is translated as the mighty hand, literally, right, the capable hand or heap. And they were a group of composers who wanted to break with the European, Austro-German academic style of composition that had been adopted by the brand new music conservatories in Moscow and St. Petersburg, led by a pair of Christian Jewish brothers, the Rubinsteins, Anton and Nikolai, and Anton a significant composer himself, perhaps their greatest claim to fame that Tchaikovsky was the greatest product of this more cosmopolitan, perhaps Western European style. And you can hear, though, with Rimsky, there's a kind of an energy that embraces some of what Orientalism brings in and infuses in music itself. Let's listen to his first symphony, which I think is notable because one of the things they're breaking with is the musical form of development. Yes, of course, famously the sonata form. And so much of the Austro-German compositional technique has to do with these very gradual, slow building blocks of theme and variation, right? And here you can see right at the beginning, this is within the first couple of minutes of his Symphony Number 1, Opus Number 1. And you can hear right away that he has a kind of explosive interruption of development for a much more exciting, energetic move forward in the music. So let's listen to just a bit of Rimsky's Symphony Number 1. It's not just the suddenness of the explosive devices, but also the tonal language. You can hear it's somewhat either unpredictable, disorienting, not entirely sonically familiar from, let's say, a more Western European or Central European world, sonic world. We'll hear that again. Let's go to one other piece to further explore this from his colleague in the Mighty Hand, Alexander Borodin, who himself had Tatar origin, and we'll go to one other composer. So, of course, one of the distinct aspects why, in a way, the Russian cultural world is sort of a bridge between the Orient, so-called, and Europe, because of the fact that it in itself incorporates part of a more Asiatic cultural legacy, cultural tradition here. And this is just at the time, of course, that, of course, what today we know as the stands, right? 5 major stand republics were just really becoming absorbed by the Russian Empire in its move east, at first as just one entity called Turkestan. And this composition will now listen to Alexander Borodin in the steppes of Central Asia. Right at the beginning, within the first minute, he paints a portrait of a camel caravan, a camel ride. Yes, the Silk Road, of course, is the central caravan route right through all of the Central Asian traders. And he even has a kind of harmonization here between what is sonically depicted as the traders and then the Russian soldiers accompanying them. So there is a kind of tone program to this music, just as there is in Scheherazade. So let's have a listen to some of Borodin's In the Steppes of Central Asia. what you can hear is the crossing of these two paths. You can hear both the kind of Orientalist and Occidentalist in one, which makes, again, these Russian texts such a unique staging ground where the construct of the Orient is still somehow contained within, yes. And if we return for a moment, once again, this is Music and Politics, and we're talking about Orientalism in music today, this whole concept, right, defined by Said as a way of defining the East in relation to the West through a series of oppositions, which locates the East in a subordinate position, presents the West as rational, progressive, adult, and masculine, and the East in turn as irrational, backward-looking, childish, and feminine, that it's a kind of binary logic, yes, of racialism and superiority, but a lot of it bound up with desire, with longing, right? We talked about the sensuousness, right, the erotic other. Let's go to one other text, an example of that. It's perhaps other than the Rimsky, Scheherazade and others, from a French ballet, Des Libres Lacme, which draws upon more relationship to South Asian, but the flower duet. Let's have a brief listen to that. Before we move on to finish. Once again, the flower duet from Des Libres Lacme, and you can hear that melismatic rising and fall, this highly ornamented musical line, almost gesturing to the kind of microtones that indeed are a distinguishing component, especially of South Asian, of Hindustani music, having a very different organization of notes there beyond, right, the chromatic scale in Western music. And that also an adornment for, right, it's a daughter of a Brahmin priest, so somewhat reminiscent of the Nile scene in Aida, which is related to, right, the worship of the female goddess, Aida, and undoubtedly kind of conflating that with kind of erotic, feminized worship dimension is very much a part of an Orientalist kind of construct. And I mean, we mentioned another, before we wrap up today, another interesting component of this Russian school, so-called Slavophile school, even though you could almost call it really a Tatar-phile school, right? The first major expansion of the Grand Duchy of Moscow, the conquest of Kazan, the capital of Tatarstan, right? And of course the famous St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow, built to commemorate that absorption. And that's really has been a major pillar of the Russian state and Russian culture since then, is that of the Tatars, right, who are descendants, of course, of what in Russian is called actually the Mongol Tatar horde, right, not just the Mongol invasion, but Tatars are mentioned as well. And of course, they are kind of a diaspora that spreads all the way right from the Black Sea to the Caspian Sea. And one of the major fiery composers of the mighty hand, Mili Balakirev himself, was of Tatar ancestry and a great composer for the solo piano. So we will listen to one of his compositions, Islame, right? I think you can hear the reference. Of course, the vast majority of Tatar practice Islam, and it's considered to be one of the most difficult, if not the most difficult, piano composition in the repertoire. So let's have a listen to this extremely agitated and also rhythmically complex and so distinct, right, from anything that if you, for instance, try to conjure up something by Mozart in your ears as you listen to Balakirev, Islame. So as we wrap up things today, this kind of inner conflict, if you like, this almost bipolar relationship, right, within what develops out of nationalism, yes, which is being drawn to something cosmopolitan and European or something deeply untamed and ethnically indigenous. Yes, these two kind of warring tendencies. We've listened to some from both, yes, today, and I thought we would end on going back to Glinka's Life of the Tsar, yes, his opera, which ultimately was used as a kind of coronation anthem for the Tsars until the revolution. But in his opera, he has a ballet scene of Polish dances, because it's about the story of the time of troubles when there was even a Polish invasion and occupation of Russia. And he kind of constructs, I thought we'd end this episode about Orientalism to listen to an example of musical Occidentalism, where he's almost in a mocking manner, kind of constructing the effete, superficial quality to this clearly identified as Occidental, as Latin, as Roman, Polish dancing music. So Glinka Life for the Tsar, the Polish dances. That is all our time for today. You've been listening to Music and Politics. Today's theme was Orientalism. Please like and subscribe. Find us at Music and Politics Pod, and visit our Patreon at Music and Politics Pod. Many nice offers for all members. Thank you, and until next time.